Well, good evening. Welcome to the National Library of Scotland Online. I'm delighted that you're all here this evening. We have 85 participants already in the call, and I think we're expecting over 100. So welcome, you're very welcome indeed. I'm Joe Marshall. I'm Associate Director for Collections Management at the National Library of Scotland, and we're here for the awards ceremony for the 2020 Elizabeth Souter Bookbinding Competition. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. This is the first time the awards have ever been done via Zoom, and we're so pleased that we can reach perhaps more people than we would normally. But please do follow the conventions for a Zoom call like this. Please keep yourselves muted and cameras off to improve the call quality. We may, of course, encounter technical hitches, as sometimes does happen with Zoom calls. If that happens, we won't panic, and we'll may just need to take a moment to pause, and we'll resume things when we can. In fact, you can hear my clock going in the background, so yes, there are always background noises. Just bear with us if there is anything like that. But the running order for tonight is that I'll say a few words about the competition, and particularly about this year's very different competition. But then it's over to introduce the winners this year, who will each tell you a little bit about their work and, of course, show you the fantastic bindings that they've created. So the competition, the Elizabeth Souter Bookbinding Competition, it recognises excellence in the field of craft bookbinding. It was initiated in 1983, sorry, by Mrs. Elizabeth Clark, formerly Souter of Murray. She sponsored the competition from 1993 until her death in 2008. And it has continued from then with support from the Magnus and Janet Souter Fund, which was set up in memory of Elizabeth's parents. So the competition aims to encourage the practice and development of both creative and craft binding skills, which display originality and, of course, fantastic craftsmanship. Judges look for a best creative binding, they also look for a best craft binding. Each category carries 2 prizes, so there is a main prize and a student prize. The competition is open to any European resident. Recent winners have hailed from France, from Spain, Germany, the UK, Belgium and the Netherlands. After each competition, the winning entries join the National Library of Scotland's collection of fine bindings. And I would add that this represents a connection with a fantastic tradition of the craft and art of the book in Scotland. The collections we have include medieval manuscripts with armorial bindings, right through the flourishing of Scottish binding in the 18th century, with the wheel and herringbone bindings that are prized by collectors around the world. And these are living traditions that we celebrate, going back to the first named Scottish binder, Patrick Lewis, who was working just outside Edinburgh in the 1450s, right up to modern work, and we're so pleased to be able to include winners from the Souter competition in the collections today, because these are living collections. As a former curator, I've long taken an interest in binding work, both in the decorative sense and also in terms of the structural work that's necessary to preserve codices for the future. So both these aspects are at the heart of the competition, and they're also very dear to the National Library of Scotland. So we have a remit to preserve the written word for future generations, and we employ specialist conservators with skills in repairing bindings and indeed in rebinding books. We live in the digital age, that's very obvious from what we're doing tonight, but at the National Library we still maintain huge collections of objects in paper, leather, wood and metal. And we have to make sure that the skills to create and preserve these objects are preserved themselves. And so we're so proud that the Elizabeth Souter competition continues to attract the fantastic talent that you're going to see tonight. So a little bit about the 2020 competition. So this was a unique competition for very obvious reasons. The competition theme was on the 1980s, based on an exhibition that we held in the late summer of 2019 with the theme Back to the Future. So the competition entrants interacted with this theme and produced a variety of exciting and original responses. A number responded to the idea of the Rubik Cube. We had several entries that had the Rubik's Cube as a theme. Others responded to 1980s comic books, photographic anthologies, And a number also picked up on classics of literature from the period. So we had a couple responding to 1984 by George Orwell, Alistair Gray's 1982 Janine, and I believe it's Alistair Gray Day Today, in fact. A Brief History of Time got a couple of entrants, and of course White Noise, which you will see slightly later this evening. So we had a very strong field. We had 32 entries in total, which is significantly more than in previous years, from all across Europe. The closing date for the competition was the 24th of February 2020, and fortunately we were able to receive all the entrants before lockdown. The judging that we had scheduled for April last year had to be postponed, and we eventually did that in October last year. So the judging in October, I should say a little bit about that. We did it in a hybrid format with one of the judges via Zoom and two of the other judges in the conservation studio with the wonderful binding entrance. It's not the ideal way to do it, but we still felt that we gave the judges a good opportunity to see the materials and to get as close to them as you can via a screen. So I want to say a very strong thanks to our judges who are unfortunately, I think, not able to be here tonight. But we had Philippa Rader, who's the co-director of the Dragon Press Bindery, and Dr. William Sachs, who's a notable private scholar and book collector. And I was a judge as well. And I do want to thank the judges for their wise and insightful contributions and their patience, given that we were doing this in a very different way. So we had a great field. We're really pleased with the entrants, and the winners should be extremely proud of the work that they've done, because they were up against some strong competition. We had a very wide European field, but this year, perhaps for the first time, all the winners actually live and work in the United Kingdom, which is an interesting fact. So those are my introductory remarks, but I'm sure you're all as keen as I am to actually meet the winners, and that's what we're going to move on to now, starting with Max Stockel. So Matt, you can see his binding here. Matt is the winner in the category for the best craft binding in the student category, and here's Matt here. Welcome, Matt. So this binding on 1982 Janine, the judges just loved this and the precision of the work. The phrase that I think the judges came up with was that this binding was particularly striking with the precision of the tooling on the boards and the overall harmonious and controlled construction. So we thought it was a wonderful object, and now I'll hand over to Matt to tell us a bit more about it.
Hi, I hope you can hear me, because apparently my network bandwidth is low, but thank you very much for this. I just want to start by saying thank you very much to everyone at the Souter Prize and the National Library of Scotland for this prize. It's incredible. It's my first competition that I've entered, binding competition. I kind of did it with hopes but not expectations, so it was an amazing surprise when I found out the results. I learned about what I know about binding from as an apprentice on the Queen's Bindery apprenticeship scheme, which has now sadly been coronated and no longer exists. But I think a lot of the thanks for this win should go to the scheme and its contributors, just for their support and tuition and the encouragement I received to do this kind of work. So I struggled initially with the theme of 1980s, just purely for its vastness. There's so many possibilities and so much to choose from. I settled on 1982 Janine for fairly obvious reasons, really. Aside from that, I love the book, and it's something that I read when I was a teenager after reading Alistair Gray's first novel, Lanark, which, if you haven't read it, is an incredible sprawling sort of world-building masterpiece, really. 1982 Janine is quite a different book. It's quite a difficult book, and it was a controversial and divisive one when it first came out. Gray himself said that it was he thought the best of his work, but he couldn't read it. He was too prudish to read it once he'd written it. So there's some difficult stuff in there. It takes place in a hotel room over a single night in the borders, possibly Peebles or Selkirk. And Jock McLeish is effectively a traveling salesman. He's drinking himself to death in this hotel room. He's creating these weird, elaborate sexual fantasy worlds in an attempt to sort of block out his own life, to block out the difficult memories of his past and his broken down relationships, and effectively his sort of failure as a human being, really. And he fails at this too, and as his memories continue to sort of pervade his fantasies, the whole thing breaks down in this big car crash. It culminates with him with his attempted suicide, and by that point, the narrative is fractured. The text itself begins to disintegrate and then explodes. And Alasdair Gray creates these incredible sort of typographic, pictorial works of art, really, out of the pages, with various narrative voices or clashing text already. And I wanted to use that in the binding as opposed to sort of fighting against it or trying to do something different, which is why I took the type and I used it, replicated it in gold from two of the more manageable passages, and translated that to the front and back boards. The gold is kind of is quite close to my heart, and it's something that really excites me about binding. I know that it's quite difficult to learn because there aren't really many people who are around to teach it anymore, and I've been very lucky to be taught by two experts, one Glenn Bartley and another one who's actually another winner tonight, Dan Ray, during time I spent at Shepherd's. A lot of the other elements of the design came quite naturally and sort of suggested themselves. The black leather and all its connotations, that seemed kind of a natural choice considering the content of Dark Fantasies and the darkness of the world that he's building around. I studied illustration before I was a bookbinder in Edinburgh College of Art quite a long time ago, and I kind of tried to introduce some of the illustrative elements into the binding, which is an ongoing process because it's a kind of a difficult thing to work out with the materials that I'm using. So the onlays on the book, as well as the board, the papers, have a transfer of a kind of a abstracted life drawing. So it's a female form, and it's duplicated and kind of messed with, and that symbolizes this fantastical figure that McLeish character creates of Janine. That's the reasoning behind that. And that's it, really. It just remains to say I'm really delighted to be here, ignoring all of my mistakes, awarding the prize. It was a surprise and a real boost in a difficult time. So
thank you very much, Matt, and that's just really inspiring to hear, you know, that where the work came from and the inspiration. And I mean it is a beautiful object, and I'm just sorry that, you know, people here can't see it a bit more closely. And you know, and of course, Alasdair Gray is, you know, such an important figure within Scotland. And for those of you on Twitter, do take a look at the Alasdair Gray archive, which is tweeting some wonderful things at the moment. So thank you, Matt, and congratulations once again. You know, a very, very worthy winner. Can we go on now to Gillian Stewart?
Hello, everybody.
Hello, Gillian. So Gillian is the winner in the Best Creative Binding in the Student category, with this binding on David Hiscock's photographs from 1982 to 1990. So the judges loved this work and the colour, and the phrase that the judges came up with to capture how they felt about this binding, and they did feel, you know, very, very, very strongly about it. This is a richly creative piece of work with excellent control of tone and colour, showing that bookbinding is an art in its own right alongside photography. But now I'll hand over to Gillian to tell us a little bit more about it herself.
Well, that's lovely. Those are lovely comments to get. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you so much for this prize. This is my second time entering the Suter, and I learned bookbinding as a scholar of the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Trust, and I learned mostly with Tom McEwen, who is a Suter Prize winner and fellow of DB. So massive thanks to Tom for all his help getting me to this level in bookbinding. So can you see both my, yep, there we are. So there's a finished binding. It's really great to get the feedback on tone and feel, because that's sort of where I start with a binding. This is the finished binding, but if we go to the next slide, we'll see where it started. So the theme obviously was the 80s, and I had initially decided to do a rebinding of a book by Ettore Sottsass, who is a designer who developed Memphis style, which is this really iconic style from the 80s that we all recognize. When the book block arrived, it was damaged, and typical, you know, me fashion, I didn't leave enough time to get another book block. So I started out with one idea in mind and couldn't couldn't bind this book. But Tom McEwen had a book block in his bindery that he wasn't using, which was the book of that I ended up binding in the end, the photographs of David Hiscock. And it actually worked out much better than my original idea. It fitted my sort of style of working a lot more, and I responded to these photographs much more strongly than I had from the book that arrived originally. I wasn't actually familiar with the work of David Hiscock, but he does a lot of analog photography and then works on top of it. So you get these really rich images that are very tactile, and I really responded to these. So I took the feel of being something quite tactile and the colours of the the dark greys and the mauve and the cream and the gold, and used that as a starting point for my binding. So I started with the end papers, which you do in a fine binding. And I cyanotype printed the end papers, and then I started the process of forwarding, which is where you sew the book together and back it and get it ready for its cover. So I only had 5 sections, which is quite small for a book. It's a bit of a challenge, but that's a good point to learn. I went on to process the leather, so I started with undyed fair goat. So I got that ready, and then I went on to the dyeing process. And I wanted to pick out these mauves and the purples and the greys, and to retain a sense of the painterly strokes that are used in the photographs. So this was the covering leather, and the next slide, please. And then I wanted to use something very tactile and process heavy, so I made inlays using a process called Laquinose, which I think was developed by Paul Zaroux. It's where you use lots of thin pairings of leather, lots of layered on top of each other with PVA, and then you sand and sand and sand and sand to reveal layers and layers underneath. So these are some of the finished inlays. They've been gold tooled and cut to size. And on the right hand one, you can see some of the end paper beneath. So that was a cyanotype printed end paper. So once I cut these out, I had to decide on how to position them and the rhythm of the cover and the feel of it. And the way that I work is always quite responsive to the materials and how they present themselves to me. I can't work by drawing a plan and then following it, because nothing ever does what I want it to. And I also really enjoy the process of learning and developing the design as I go. So I spent quite a bit of time trying to find a way for these to work together in a way that felt right. And it wasn't quite working. I think you can see in the next slide another combination I was trying, and it just wasn't working for me. I'm definitely not a minimalist. I think I'm a maximalist. So it was just looking a bit too sparse for me. So on the next step, you'll see how I ended up sort of pulling it together. So I cut out this inlay from the cover, the front and the back board, which is quite a terrifying process to slice into something that you spent hours binding. But it felt right. The shape echoed the photographs inside. So it felt like a way to sort of bring the interpretation out in a way that worked for me. And then it was just a case of playing about with the rhythm of the inlays until they fit, and then the tooling on top until we had the finished binding. And then I think the last slide is the leather joint, which was of the end papers, and then the leather doublure, which is the sort of the inside of the cover, which was dyed. I had back paired onlays, and then it was sanded, sort of echoing the Laquinose inlays. So there we are, whistle stop tour of my binding. But yeah, it's honestly such an honour to have been awarded, and like Matt was saying, it's a really, really great boost in a bit of a tough year. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Gillian, and thanks very much for that lovely description. I'm just in awe of people who can do these wonderful things, having no practical skills myself whatsoever, and it is always interesting to see a bit more about the actual process of construction. So now we're going to go on to Chris Hicks, whose binding was highly commended. So Chris has done a binding on Voltaire's Candide, which we just loved as a beautiful and colourful object that also tells a story in its own right. The judges had a phrase to describe it, and they said, "This is a binding to make you smile, a fantastic piece of colourful work with a nice interpretation of the book's theme." So I'll now hand over to Chris, who can hopefully tell us a bit more about that theme and how it works.
Hello everyone, thank you very much for asking me to take part. I'm delighted to have won a prize this year. Absolutely amazing. So why did I choose this book? Well, I was fortunate to see the exhibition actually in Edinburgh towards the end of 2019. But in fact, I'd already chosen the book by then. I bound copies of this book for the publisher. It said Inky Parrott Private Press Edition of Voltaire's Candide, published in the 1980s, in the 1980s. And part of the deal was that I would have a set of sheets for my own use. So I still had those available. And having read the book, it did strike me that the sort of very fragmented and chaotic nature of the story involved really rather reflected my view of the 1980s. I found it a very chaotic decade. I was building my business, moving house, marriage, children, all that sort of thing. So Candide's pass through his world at the time seemed rather apposite. So that was the first challenge. The second challenge was the materials and the technique. Like most binders, I got quite a lot of large offcuts of leather, none of which would have bound a book in their own right. They weren't big enough, but my wife gave me a challenge. Could I find a way of making use of these offcuts? So what I did was to sort out a whole load of them and put them together to create a background piece of leather that was large enough to bind the book. It's quite difficult to see, but in fact, in the background of the binding, you can't, in the picture, there are perhaps 7 or 8 large pieces of different colours. So I had to scarf joint them all together, but inevitably there was some unevenness there and the thickness of the leather varied. And I wanted to get it as smooth and as level as possible. So what I then did was, before I actually put it on the book, was to prepare all the onlays, which again are multicolored and mainly Morocco, paired paper thin and then glued on. And there are lots of small pieces in between the larger ones. They actually are gold kid leather, which was something I'd acquired many years ago and now finally found a use for. So I put all the onlays together, put them all on the leather itself, the base leather, then turned the whole thing over and paired the back so that it ended up level and as smooth as I could possibly get it, as even as I could get it. And from that point, I could then cover the book with it. And once it was dry and ready, I could add gold tooling, which runs right, a mass of gold tool dots, which run right across the cover and round onto the paste downs of the end papers. And that basically was the technique I used. So I felt that was a good way of using up all the leather I'd got stashed away, or at least some of it, and creating a colourful binding. And yes, as the judges said, it is colourful, and I do like to use colour in my bindings. So I hope that gives some indication of the way it went. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And we certainly did love the colour, and also I think the idea that the crazy paving is a little bit like Candide's muddly path through life. So we always like it when there's this interplay between the material form and the binding and what the text actually tells. So yes, thank you very much, and thank you for that well deserved, highly commended binding. So we're now going to move on to Daniel Ray, who's the best winner in the best craft binding overall category. And one of the things that we always look for is how close to perfection you can get with a binding. And this is a binding on 1984, and I'm sure Daniel will say a bit about how the binding speaks to the themes of that important book. The judges said of this binding, it was difficult to find any fault. It's superbly executed and very detailed piece, finished to the highest standard, which reflects the dark mood of the novel. So congratulations to Daniel, and now I'll hand over to him to tell us a bit more about it.
Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you. Thank you very much to the National Library of Scotland for choosing me as a winner. Yes, so 1984 I chose because it's one of my favourite books by one of my favourite authors, which is always a much easier place to start when you've got something you really enjoy. And also happened to read it for the first time in 1984, when I think we were made to by the school. And I always remember that because the atmosphere of the book is obviously very different to the actual 1984 that we will experience. But at the same time, for me, it's slightly synonymous because I first experienced it at that time. So it's kind of forever linked in my head with real 1984. So it's a wonderful book, very dark in many ways, and I think we're probably all familiar with this text. So my choice of kind of the decoration here is quite crudely my little TV screens, the Big Brother screens with the eye watching you. So the TV screens themselves, the kind of the rectangles, they're made by putting little rectangular pieces of manila underneath the leather, and then it's kind of just smoothed in and then tooled around afterwards once the leather's been applied. And the mother of pearl inlays they're just inlaid in. So I made a little punch, domed off my every single little mother of pearl, and I've made a little punch which perfectly cut out the leather so they could be inserted nice and neatly. And then it was the titling, which is I always like titling. I always see it as a nice opportunity to kind of playing with letters. I do a lot of this professionally, so I'm not a stranger to it. But I do. It's nice when I get a free form kind of open-ended thing where I can just kind of make it up myself. So I usually sit there with a notebook and a sort of vague design and just start kind of working out how I can arrange it in an interesting way. And I was very happy with this one. But I didn't make a huge mistake, which nobody's ever picked up on. But the bands at the top on the spine were actually supposed to be the bottom ones. The top one's supposed to be the bottom one, and the bottom one should be at the top, so it lines up with the second line of. But I didn't realise this until I'd actually covered it. By which point I decided it didn't really matter very much. So just for your information, there is a massive mistake there. But it doesn't seem to have done it any harm. So yeah, and the edges and the inside, I really wanted to get this sort of greyness of, the book is pervaded with this kind of wonderful textural grey kind of depressing kind of atmosphere, and I really wanted to just kind of get a bit of that. So I made the end papers literally by just scrunching up a load of paper and dunking it in all sorts of dyes, and then letting it dry out and see what it looked like. And the edges, again, I just wanted to kind of emulate that, so it kind of continued that kind of motif kind of continued onto the edges, which I did just playing with acrylic paint and bits of paper. I seem to remember painting it on and pulling it off with a piece of paper and adding more and different colours and just seeing what happened, let it kind of grow. And that's about all I can say about it, really. I very much enjoyed making it. I enjoyed I do enjoy the finished result.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you for disclosing the hidden flaws that we certainly didn't notice, and I don't think it impairs the success of the work in any way. So.
It's only a mistake if someone notices. Otherwise, it's just a design opportunity.
Absolutely. So thank you once again, and again, it's lovely to hear more about the background for these ideas and where they came from. Thank you, Daniel. Very well deserved. So we now move on to Andreas Maroulis. So Andreas is the winner in the best creative binding overall category with this binding on Don DeLillo's White Noise. This was a binding which really jumped out for the judges, you know, from an early point in the viewing. In fact, what the judges said was that this binding stood out from the other entrants as a truly striking piece of work with a subtle and effective design that speaks to the postmodern novel and the time of its writing in the 1980s. So now over to Andreas to tell us a little bit more about his work.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Joe. I'm really honored to win this prize, which I have already framed here. And yeah, it was a great pleasure to work on this book, and the competition, the Elizabeth Shooter competition, was a great motivation to get me going on the design work. Don DeLillo's White Noise was published in 1985, and although the author is referring to the American society of that era, it still feels very contemporary, if not prophetic in some things. And there are a lot of interesting points that someone could discuss about this book, but I will only focus on the few things that triggered my design ideas. The author comments on the way we live in the modern West world, and it's basically a book about death and the fear of death, and what we actually do in our era to forget about it, and how we try to cover this kind of fear. And the main idea of the book is the consumption of our Western world, and we consume a lot. We surround ourselves with useless things that basically create a small kingdom where we can feel like immortal kings, and therefore we forget about our mortality. And the title of the book, which, if I recall correctly, the author tried a lot of different titles, but he chose this one at the end, refers to the nothingness and this kind of noise that the devices, the appliances create, especially the older ones, because nowadays it's not the same anymore. And all this kind of meaningless surrounding environment that we live in, and makes us to forget sometimes the essential elements of life. So my design was based on this kind of human mortality. I picked a couple of colors that the one reminded me of the human flesh, and the other one of the soil, the ground. And on the front cover, we can see a few appliances abandoned. It's inspired from the 80s, so all the appliances have something. The fridge and the washing machine, the TV have something about from the design of that era, and they're half buried in the ground. And it's a graveyard of technology goods that have died out, and they no longer serve us. And out of these appliances, there is a kind of cloud coming up out, a cloud or an airborne toxic event, as the author describes it, or a white noise, if you like. And this kind of cloud expands to the whole area. And on the back cover, we can see that tends to cover also our own graveyards, which means our own mortality and our own inevitable end. So I should add here that the whole binding was completed just before we hear anything about COVID. So the airborne toxic event that the author speaks about is complete. It's a coincidence. I had no idea about all this thing with the virus back then. But it was a great book to work on, and a lot of things to discuss about it. Hopefully that wasn't very depressing to finish the evening with. And I'm really grateful to all the people from the National Library of Scotland, as also to my tutor Glenn Bartley, and to the Queen's Binding Apprenticeship Scheme that I was part of, as Matt said before. And winning the prize has given me now the courage and motivation to to follow this path of the design work, which is really great. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas. Again, that's really inspiring, and of course we're always pleased to hear when these prizes encourage people to go on and pursue careers in book crafts and the book arts. I mean, we need the more of that, the better. So again, really nice to hear about the inspiration for the binding, and I didn't find that depressing at all. I think actually it shows that book binding is extremely relevant to our contemporary world and contemporary society, and that's something that we just have to keep reiterating, to keep these traditions alive and thriving. So I've really enjoyed hearing from all 5 winners. I hope you listening around the world have as well, and I know that many of you may have sort of further questions, and please get in touch with the National Library of Scotland after the event, and we'd be very happy to talk to you more either about book bindings or about other things that we do. I should say a few words before we finish about the future of the Elizabeth Souter bookbinding competition. So we are now running this competition every 2 years. The next competition will be in 2022. The theme of the 2022 competition will be Scotland's Stories. So 2022 is the Scottish Government's Year of Scotland's Stories, which is described as a showcase of the country's rich literature, film, oral traditions and myths and legends. So we are asking entrants to submit to the competition bookbindings which relate to the creative work of Scottish authors, or collections of short stories or legends relating to Scotland. So we're happy to accept entries which are translations of the works of Scottish authors into other languages. Entrants might be inspired by classic authors like Sir Walter Scott or Robert Burns, Robert Louis Stevenson, or more modern writers like Lewis Grassic Gibbons, some of our forgotten women writers. There are plenty of modern authors, Janice Galloway, Irvine Welsh, Jackie Kay, Alistair Gray, of course, has already made an appearance tonight, A.L. Kennedy, James Robertson, and there are many, many more. So we hope that entrants will be inspired by the wide range of literature produced by Scotland's writers, past and present, and Scotland's vibrant literary culture today. And hopefully there'll be something to inspire a wide range of applicants next year. So the competition will be launched, in fact, this year in April 2021, and do look out for this going live on our website. The submission deadline will be February 2022. So there is a good lead-in time, and plenty of information will be going up on the website shortly, and we hope to see a good number of submissions this year. So I hope that's inspired you, and those of you who are practicing in the book arts and the book crafts, please do consider that, and we'll be delighted to hear from you. But for those of you here tonight who have other interests, please do stay in touch with us at the National Library of Scotland. We have a range of interesting talks and events. At the moment, they're all online. At some point, hopefully in the next few months, there may be things in person once again, but do sign up for our newsletter. Do look out for the online events, and we'd be very, very pleased to see many of you here again soon. So to finish tonight, I just want to thank the trustees, the Elizabeth Souter trustees, for their loyal support of the bookbinding competition, and for other activities that they support in memory of Elizabeth Souter. And we do value their support enormously. It's not simply about financial support, it's about the encouragement and the communication that really keeps this competition and other activities going. So big thank you to them. I want to thank the entrants, so everyone who submitted a bookbinding for this year's competition. We were so pleased that you thought of us. Congratulations to the winners, and thank you for coming along tonight and telling us a bit more about what you do. I'd like to thank the judges once again, and Bill Zacks and Philippa Rader, for their support and persistence in some difficult times. Thank you to the staff at the National Library of Scotland for setting up tonight's event, including our loyal technical support. We are grateful. Without you, these events couldn't happen. And thanks to everyone who's come along tonight. So it's really good to see so many people here, and I know you've come in from countries across the world. Yeah, very pleased that we were able to welcome you tonight. But that's us for tonight. It's been good to see you. We'll finish the meeting, and we hope to see many of you again soon. But bye for now.